Hello readers, welcome to Planet Fantasy, where we talk about fantasy, science fiction, horror, and speculative fiction. Bonus episodes will feature shows and movies and anything else that I want to talk about. I am your host Moses, and before we get started, if you're watching me on YouTube, make sure you click that like and subscribe button. And if you're tuning into the podcast, subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any new releases. Now, on to the show. Welcome to the show, fans of infernal beasts. Today I am talking about the 2012 novel Between Two Fires, written by American author Christopher Buehlman. First, I'll go over what I heard about this book before I read it. We're going to talk a little bit about Christopher and the development of this book. We're going to hash out the plot, spoilers, and discuss what I think are the more interesting lore devices that I noticed. The book is currently sitting at 4.3 stars on Goodreads, according to a lot of ratings, 14,674 to be exact, and is sitting at 4.6 stars on Amazon out of 5,000 ratings. So here is the description taken from Christopher's official website. The year is 1348. The Black Death ravages France, leaving fields and rivers choked with unburied dead and causing whole towns to disappear. Tomas, a disgraced knight, roams the land with a band of thieves living by the sword. When they encounter an orphaned girl in a dying village, Tomas has just enough humanity in him to save her from his colleagues. No ordinary child, this girl sees angels and talks to the dead. She tells Tomas that Lucifer and the fallen angels have risen in a new war on heaven, that the kingdoms of men have fallen behind the lines of battle, and that he must now shepherd her on a holy quest to tip the scales in favor of good. Between Two Fires invites you on a journey that is at once a fool's errand into great danger and a violent man's first uncertain steps toward redemption. According to Publishers Weekly, fans of historical fantasy and horror will find this epic darkly rewarding. And then according to a publication called the Kirkus Review, Cormac McCarthy's The Road meets Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in this frightful medieval epic about an orphan girl with visionary powers in plague-devastated France. And then finally from Shelf Awareness, by combining modern horror dynamics with a convincing medieval setting, Christopher Buehlman secures his status among today's leading dark fantasy authors. So why did I read this book? This was highly recommended as the must-read Halloween fantasy book on multiple subreddit threads. Almost every query I found on the internet about fantasy books to read during the month of October contained this book as a recommendation. Now, I had never heard of Christopher before, but since it was so highly rated, I had to check it out. And there was something funny I noticed on the copy that I got from the library was that it looked like almost every time the book had been checked out was actually around the month of October for several years. So that told me that I'm not the only one looking to the internet to find month-specific books to read. I was also intrigued by the medieval setting, that's what I'm going to call it because I'm tired of saying medieval. I was intrigued by the medieval setting since I think that the fall season does in fact lend itself to medieval settings for whatever reason. And I was also intrigued by the fact that I just may learn a thing or two from the book. I take historical fiction, especially fantasy historical fiction books, with a huge grain of salt. I think that should be clear, but it turns out that this book is very much grounded in a specific time frame of real-world history. And I used to believe that reading should always aim at the goal of learning something, like facts about the world or history or science. Otherwise, it was somehow an inferior exercise to reading strictly for pleasure. And, I've since left those feelings behind because I believe that the human experience is more than just consuming facts that other people consider are important, but it does come up occasionally. And when it does, this book was a good reminder that there are actually gems out there that meet both criteria. They are entertaining, but also contain some facts. So let's meet Mr. Christopher Buehlman, the author. He says that he was born in Tampa, Florida in 1969, and that he became involved in the culture of Renaissance fairs when he was 18 years old, and that he completed his bachelor's degree in French in 1994 at Florida State University. And before I talk about any more facts about his life, I want to point out that he seems to be kind of an interesting guy, and that's based on the way that he presents himself on social media and even the way that he describes himself. So his descriptions of his life and career that I've found on both his personal website and on his Writer's Net profile share personal details about his life that I don't think most people would share on platforms like that. The way I see it is that it seems like he describes himself as either sort of self-aware or in an absurd way, as if he wants to communicate his individuality through something as bland as just an internet profile or a book jacket. And I can appreciate that. But my point is that he definitely has a vibe, and that vibe is the kind of person that I would expect to be a Renaissance fair sort of fellow. Apparently he did or does still to this day walk around Renaissance fairs, or Ren fairs as the people inside the Beltway called them. He does or did walk around Ren fairs, and I can't really tell exactly what it is that he did. Either he insulted his customers directly, or customers would pay him to write insults for them so that they could use those on other people. I'm not sure which that is, but either way, he did this as a character called Christoph the Insulter, verbal mercenary. And doesn't that just kind of sound like a cheesy yet enthusiastic and passionate Renaissance fair kind of guy? He also says that he speaks French and Spanish, and he enjoys film, theater, cooking, travel. So I'm with him on those. And then he says he also enjoys martial arts, traditional archery, and stage combat choreography. He lost me on those three, but it looks like he minored in history and composed several award-winning poems. As far as his list of published works, it looks that his website is not totally up to date. It lists 4 books, but it looks like he's sitting at 6 published books as of this episode. His most recent being a book called The Black Tongue Thief, which was published by Tor, one of the premier fantasy publishers, that was published in 2021. I've also seen that book on the threads as a recommended read, so I'm going to check that one out soon. I also enjoyed the prose of Between Two Fires, so I'd like to spend more time in his work. And finally, as I mentioned before, he's on social media, particularly on Instagram is where I checked him out. He appears to be a cat fan. So if you're curious about him and you want to see kind of what I'm talking about, check out his Instagram, check out his social media and his website, and get a little glimpse into who he is as a person. So now I want to get into the concept and development of this book before we get into the plot. Christopher talks about the book on a YouTube video that I'm going to recommend to you on a channel called the Ty and That Guy channel, if you want to listen to the entire episode. But I'm going to give you the highlights here, okay? So about this book, in my opinion, this book is in fact fantasy. That's how it's marketed. But I would say that it is a unique category of fantasy. And I'm calling that category theological fantasy. This means that what would normally be considered magic or magical in a traditional fantasy work is actually, in that universe, either celestial or demonic. So you do not have magic per se, as you would in a classic magical fantasy story, but the forces at work that appear to be magical are in fact holy or unholy. I have not seen the category of theological fantasy anywhere online. That's just my category that I've come up with, and it helps me describe what I think is a really unique book here. And I think it's important that I make that distinction because Christopher talks about some of his theological opinions in that video. And I think that those views, when you know them, add an extra dimension to this book because it is, in fact, theological fantasy. Now, regarding his personal theological views, I think it's fair to say that Christopher does not appear to personally believe Orthodox Christian or Catholic views, particularly his thoughts on hell. So, for example, he seems to think that hell is a form of psychological torture for children, almost like a type of emotional child abuse. So that's not an orthodox position. But on the other hand, he does also seem to think highly of a certain interpretation of Jesus Christ. So I don't think that his personal views are really easily pinned down. He describes himself as a very secular person, but that he also feels that the writing of this book, Between Two Fires, put him in touch with what he describes as a version of the Christian faith that makes sense to him. And you know what? I like that. I think that it elevates the work beyond what could easily have been anti-Catholic or an anti-religious projection on behalf of the author, right? So I think he avoids that pitfall when it comes to writing something like a theological fantasy. When I was reading the book, I noticed that he clearly did his research, and he confirms that in that interview as well. And apparently he had to peruse, multiple French sources for stuff like accurate bridge names and street names and whatnot. So that adds an extra dimension. I also think it's helpful to know the historical context of the Black Plague and the spiritual mindset of the day, since that is the backdrop of this story. And so I'm going to share a little bit about that history. So according to worldhistory.org, the first Black Plague, as far as we know, originated in Asia, and it traveled along the Silk Road and was called the Plague of Justinian, which occurred around 541 AD when it hit the city of Constantinople. And this first Black Plague killed dozens of millions of people. I'd never heard of this one. I'd only ever heard of the Black Plague, the one being the one that occurred in Europe during the 13 and 1400s as the definitive Black Plague, but apparently there was one almost 1,000 years before it. So after this one killed millions of people in Constantinople in 541, it died down and it seemed to disappear until it reappeared in Asia again around 1321, and it reached Europe some 20 years later through rats on ships into Italy. And with airplanes at this point, we could have a plague or a virus immediately jump from Europe to Asia or Asia to America in 24 hours. But back in the day, it would take a little bit longer, horseback, through the rats, through the boats, and it took it about 20 years to come from Asia back into Europe in 1321. Now, the plague in question here, it can be called several things. It's got several names. The first one is the Black Death, or the Black Plague, or even the more scientific name, the bubonic plague. And this one that is the backdrop for Between Two Fires occurred specifically in Europe during the years of 1347 through 1352. So it was a 5-year period. And guess what? Some people estimate that between 25 to 50 million people died from this tragedy, which would mean about either on the low end 30% of Europe's population died, or up to 60% of Europe's population if you go with the maximal statistics. So we're looking at either 3 out of 10 or 6 out of 10 people. Either way, even with the lowest estimates, that's a lot of people dying really tragic, horrific ways. And so there are three types of plague. There's the bubonic, there's the pneumonic, as in pneumonia, and then there's the septicemic plague. But this plague in Europe that we're talking about was primarily the bubonic plague, although it probably had pneumonic and septicemic elements within it as well. Symptoms of the bubonic plague included swelling of the lymph nodes, particularly in the groin and the armpits, and those would eventually turn this horrible black color. Those areas there are these sores called buboes, and the afflicted person would probably die within 3 days. Isn't it terrible? I mean, from the first time you contracted or exhibit some sort of symptom, within 3 days, more than likely you were dead. And the reason it was called the Black Plague was because the fact that the buboes would turn black on your body. And people died faster, and this is mentioned in the description of the book actually, but people died faster than they could be buried. So there were just carts of dead bodies all around the European countryside. It was a common sight. What were the responses? How did people respond to this natural disaster? Well, they were, of course, varied, as people are varied, and their responses to pandemics are varied, as we have just recently learned. But the only true cure that was practiced was quarantine. Although there were definitely, since this is the medieval period we're talking about, there were definitely other less helpful methods that people tried. And, that's kind of part and parcel for the way medicine was practiced in the 13 and 1400s. So these are some things that really stood out to me. Some people sought out unicorn horns to find the mythological unicorn, to obtain its horn, to crush it and drink it as a cure. So that legend developed. There were magical potions that people would try. Some people tried crushing up emeralds and drinking those. And then you have the things that just make us gasp in horror today as just self-evidently destructive. But back then they didn't know. Some of the poor people would drink mercury or arsenic, things that are blatantly poisonous, as we know today. But then they just didn't know. And there were all these really unhelpful concoctions and potions going around. People would carry flowers up to their face to fight what they believed was called bad air, which is not totally unfounded, since some germs and viruses are airborne. But they believed just holding the flowers, nice smelling flowers, up to their mouths and their faces would prevent the bad air. And the worst treatment, I think, has always kind of made me queasy, and it's bloodletting, where people would cut themselves, or the doctor would cut you to drain out your blood in the hopes of draining out what was making you sick. Wealthy and poor both had all of these types of treatments, but one thing that the wealthy people could do was flee to the countryside. But the poor people in the cities, they couldn't go anywhere. They were stuck in the city. And so given the time period, it's also the case that there were religious responses to this too. So there were the classic responses such as prayers, church services, and masses, where people would ask God to have mercy on them. Many theological thought leaders believe that the bubonic plague was some type of divine punishment for the sins of the people. And so you also saw some more radical religious treatments going on. This was during the time where self-flagellation really prospered. People would whip themselves on the back, or they would hurt their body in an attempt to show God that they were sorry for their sins. But the plague also ended up creating significant and lasting changes in society at large. This is around the time that the European feudal system began to collapse, as land workers fled the land that they were working, and they moved into other parts of the world to find work. This is also the time that some women were actually beginning to receive land rights, and some historians even mark the bubonic plague as the turning point, as the bookend between the Middle Ages and what would become the modern era. And as an aside, one thing that I personally find interesting about the plague is that it occurred during what some would argue is the height of church theology. This was around the time of the death of St. Thomas Aquinas. It was shortly thereafter his death, but this was a significant theological and philosophical era. And so the plague definitely became the subject of theological speculation in a way that plagues today in particularly Western cultures do not. So for example, during COVID-19, the very first question that most people in America or Western countries seemed to ask was not a theological question. People were not seeking a theological reason for why COVID-19 developed and was spreading, but instead they were seeking scientific answers. Because of this, and because of the fact the church responded in such a way to the plague, some historians believe that the church's response and the plague itself significantly affected the medieval church in such a negative way because of public perception. And it was thus a stepping stone. The plague was a stepping stone to the Protestant Reformation and the eventual collapse of the church monopoly, the Catholic Church monopoly, in spirituality in Europe. There's also another piece of history to know that is relevant to the plot of this book, and it is the real-world history known as the Avignon Papacy, or what's also known as the Avignon Controversy. This was a period of church history in which there were multiple Catholic popes, which were located in Avignon, France, and not Rome, due to the influence of the King of France, Philip IV. These popes are known as the Avignon popes, and it was during this time that the plague hit Europe. So the plague happened during a time of church upheaval. The pope in question during the bubonic plague was Pope Clement VI, and he is actually a prominent character in the third act of this book. Because again, as I mentioned, this book blends real-world history with fiction and fantasy. So keep in mind when I review the plot, as the climax of the story occurs at the papal palace in Avignon and not Rome. And so the real-world Avignon papacy would conclude in 1417 with the Council of Constance, which was several years after the conclusion of the bubonic plague. And then, of course, there's one more piece of context I would like to mention, which is the idea of holy relics. At one point in the story, our characters obtain a significant relic called the Holy Lance, or the Spear of Destiny, which according to legend was the spear which pierced the side of Jesus Christ during the crucifixion. Now, as with other relics, there are multiples floating around today that claim to be authentic. There are, from what I can find on the internet, there are at least 4 relics that claim to be the authentic Holy Lance, and they are located in Rome. There's one in Vienna, there's one in Antioch, and there's another one in Armenia. And it's a fascinating story. You can actually Google pictures of these lances, all of which claim to be the authentic one. But the reason I mention it here, and the important thing to know about them, is that relics were peddled far and wide throughout the medieval world, especially during the bubonic plague, because the seller would claim that this item contained spiritual power, and it could be yours for protection or for God's blessing for a small price, of course. And storytellers love a good relic. They are in all superhero or fantasy or even sci-fi stories, even though the word relic is not something that signifies something that would be in a modern movie. They are in basically every fantasy or adventure story. So think of Excalibur, think of Luke Skywalker's lightsaber, think of the sword of Godric Gryffindor, think of Thanos' Infinity Gauntlet, think of the Holy Grail in Indiana Jones. But in this book, the relic is literally a relic, which makes it, in my opinion, interesting storytelling. Now, as far as media adaptations, as far as I can find online, I can't find any sort of planned media adaptation for Between Two Fires, although I can totally see this succeeding as an anime. I think it's something along the lines of Netflix's Castlevania series. I could see this story being drawn and animated in that sort of style. For some reason, it seems that the Asian animators in particular really excel in magical or fantasy type animations, and it's not unusual to see classic Catholic religious imagery in non-religious anime. So that's what came to my mind. So now that you know the historical context and the context of the author, let's get into the plot. As always, I'm going to be spoiling this story. But of course, I can't talk about all the plot points. I'm just going to hit the high notes. So if you hear something in this story that you think would be really interesting and you would want to know more about, definitely read the book for yourself. So our story begins with an introduction in the style of what I would call the Old Testament. We are told that there are theological reasons for the story that are about to unfold. And the primary reason is that Satan, or Lucifer, plans to lay waste to the world through a terrible plague, which we shortly find out is the bubonic plague from the 1300s in Europe. Now, as always, I did not read the description of this book. I basically just read that lots of people liked it. They recommended the book, so I read it. I like to go into a movie blind or into a book blind and be genuinely surprised by the plot points. So I did not know, as you do, dear listener, that the plague was a major plot point here. This introduction and the other interludes that it has sprinkled throughout remind me of the writing style seen in what are called the historical books of the Bible. Books like the Book of Kings or the Book of Chronicles. And from the beginning, it's safe to assume as a reader that this is true according to the internal lore of the book. And at the end of each interlude, we are told that, quote, "The Lord made no answer," end quote. We know from the beginning, from the very first page, that God and Lucifer exist in the lore of this book, but the unanswered question is, where is God when all of this is happening? I was wondering if the story was going to take a more nihilistic approach and have God killed in some way from the beginning, but it's a very interesting introduction. And so after we get the introduction in the theological sense, we meet our protagonist, Tomas, who is a disgraced knight. He is present in the European countryside, and we learn some of his backstory, a little bit at the beginning, but mostly throughout his character arc. We learn that he fought in a particular battle, the Battle of Crécy, which was a real battle that occurred in northern France between the English and the French. And at this battle, the French were terribly defeated. If you know anything about medieval history in this time of world history, you know that the French and the English were always at each other's throats. So, again, we have a real historical moment occurring in a fantasy book. After this battle, Tomas was stripped of his lands and his titles, and even his wife. His wife was taken by the Count de Vreux, whose name is Christian. So Tomas is the primary POV character in this book, and he is presented as this battle-hardened mercenary who is only looking out for himself. He kind of has Han Solo type vibes to me. We get a glimpse of his character, though, when he and the bandits he's traveling with encounter this young orphan girl, and he interferes to prevent these rogues from taking advantage of her. So we find out that her name is Delphine, and she claims that she has these revelations and visions about the spiritual realities of this plague. Tomas does not actually learn her name for a long time. I think we're 100 pages into the book before we learn her name. And so there's a long stretch of time, and there's definitely a character arc where Tomas is very much the reluctant hero figure with Delphine. And he curses a lot, and they have this really playful banter, but his actions often demonstrate that he seems to care for her in some small ways. So she suggests that she and Tomas travel to the city of Paris and then on to the city of Avignon, because she feels, for whatever reason, that she's being led to these cities. So they set out on their journey, and the first significant encounter they have occurs in a village that is being terrorized by this monster in the river. And it's here that our duo meets our third character, a priest named Father Matthew. And it's also where our party meets their very first monster or demon. The creature is shaped like an eel, but it has what looks like a human hand on its tail, which I assume, it's never explicitly stated, but I assume it's used to lure people into the water under the pretense that there is a person drowning. So either way, Tomas kills the beast, and they officially befriend Father Matthew, who we find out is an alcoholic priest. We learn that Father Matthew has this complex backstory. He was a faithful and devoted priest, but he wound up being disgraced by his village because he was caught bathing in the river with no clothes on with a younger man with whom he had become infatuated with. So he is a disgraced priest, and it is in this village that occurred. But that occurred right before the plague happened, and so he's been hanging around kind of as this outcast in this town. So he has nothing left in this town. He has no reason to stay. But he does tell Tomas and Delphine that he has a brother who is also serving in the clergy in Avignon. So he joins them on their journey. So the duo have now become a trio. So they travel through the land and several towns on their way to Paris, and they encounter a lot of terrible things. I should say the book definitely has a plot. It definitely has a straight line, but multiple chapters feel almost like anthology stories. So in one chapter, you'll have this encounter with this monster, and then they leave that town and go to the next town. And so it's definitely a coherent narrative, and it also feels like an anthology series in a way. So they set out on this adventure to go to the city of Paris. They run into a lot of terrible things along the way, since the plague is not only bad enough in itself, but it's also got a demonic influence. At one point, Tomas and Father Matthew, they enter this really strange castle during the night. Although Delphine says that they shouldn't, she ends up climbing a tree and hiding in a tree. But they find this night tournament. Night, pun not intended. It's a tournament for nights, but it's also taking place at night. And it has this decadent party with this troupe of women in various states of undress, and they're running around with these animal masks. It was a pretty delirious scene, and they discover when daylight approaches that all the people were actually dead, including the women. So it's this very feverish, fever dream type scene. And then another scene involves them arriving in Paris, and there's a different type of creature that's terrorizing the people there. It's a creature or a monster that knocks on people's doors at night, and when they answer the door, these creatures kill whoever answered. Now, the twist with that is that these creatures are actually revealed to be these statues from the churches that come out and hurt people. So the statues of the apostles and the Holy Family. And it reminded me of those Doctor Who angels, the weeping angels, I think is what they're called. At another point, Delphine obtains the Holy Lance, which is the relic, as I mentioned earlier. And so the story, it has that anthology feel. Separate horror stories that occur on the road. But I'm here to hit the high points. So if you want to read about those, read the book. But one of the most significant monster events that happens when the three are on a raft with a group of men who plan to slay them for their money. They successfully fight off the brigands, but they encounter this monster in the river. It's a demon in the River Rhine, and it's a giant gelatinous jellyfish type creature, and it has human heads floating around within the jelly. And it's here that Father Matthew, he acts heroically to save Delphine. He's stung many times by the demon and ultimately succumbs to his injuries. It's a really sad scene. After this, Tomas runs up against the Count d'Evreux on the road. This is a man who was involved in the war that led to Thomas becoming disgraced. And so he has met his mortal enemy, and so he enacts his revenge. And this is where this almost magical type thing happens. He defeats the Count, and then he somehow takes on the Count's visage. I thought that it was just the fact that he put on his clothes and took his name, but I think if I remember correctly, after his revenge, I think Delphine baptizes him in the river, and when he emerges from the water, he now looks like the Count. Now that matters because he is going into Avignon, and the Count has apparently connections there. People know him. So Thomas and Delphine, who is going to disguise herself as a young boy, are going to infiltrate and find out what they can with these aliases. So they finally reach the city of Avignon, and they meet up with the deceased Father Peter's. Well, they finally reach the city of Avignon. They meet up with Father Matthew's brother, and his name is Robert. And he tells them that he is the reluctant lover of one of the cardinals who has direct contact with the Pope, Clement VI. Remember, this fictional Clement VI is based on an actual Pope, Clement VI. So Delphine is convinced that this Pope, who has apparently been spreading all this evil and all of this licentiousness during this time period, is an imposter. So Thomas asks Robert to use his connection to the cardinal to gain an audience with this Pope. Now, as it turns out, the Pope is in fact an imposter, and he's been imitated by a particularly terrible demon. I can't remember which one I think it's Beelzebub or Azazel, but I can't remember which. But they locate the true Pope Clement VI. He's imprisoned, and he's locked in this barrel. And so the climax of the story happens with this confrontation at the papal palace of Avignon, where they confront these unholy forces that have swarmed the papal palace, and it's the climactic chapter. God finally answers Satan's forces. Delphine ends up perishing during the battle, and yet it's through her body that the forces of heaven, a host of angels, emerge to do battle. Thomas descends into hell, but he is rescued by Delphine, who is resurrected with no memory of the event, and the two travel away together. So there is a lot going on in this book. So let's interact with the lore here, the more interesting part of the story. So the most obvious point through the story is the idea that the narration is true. In this universe, Satan is in fact responsible for the plague, and God, for whatever reason, has delayed his intervention. That message, even though it is theological fantasy, that question resonates for people of faith, because it's a primary point of Christian theology that time is only imposed on creation, not God. And so many years of suffering for a human is relative to the timelessness of God. It also touches on the theological idea of what is called theodicy, which is a type of question within theology, which is discourse about the apparent contradiction between the image of a loving God with the existence of evil, both natural evil and human evil. It's not uncommon to hear theological arguments or debates or discussion eventually turn to that idea. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma, the idea that if God is good and if he is all powerful and if he exists in this classical way that we understand him, or at least the church teaches him to exist, then why evil? Why does God allow evil, or why does he create it? Whether that evil is something like the Holocaust, or it's something like an earthquake that kills dozens of people. The conclusion of the Euthyphro dilemma in the minds of many is that God is either unwilling to help, or he is unable to help, or he doesn't exist at all. Whereas the theological position is that there is a higher purpose that maybe cannot be grasped by humans who are bound by time, that maybe God, for some unknown and mysterious reason, has something better planned from that. So the lore in this book, although it is not theology proper, it does interact with the science of theology in, I think, a very compelling way, and thus theological fantasy. The second lore point that I really enjoyed was just how horrific the monsters were portrayed. Not only are they grotesque and scary, and I totally skated over those in the plot, but they're also blasphemous, which checks out with the medieval depiction of devils or demons in theology and art. I think my favorite monster was actually the first one, the river monster, because it's unique, at least in the way that Christopher has portrayed it in this book. If you read lots of fantasy, or if you play fantasy video games, you know that river monsters are common in fantasy lore. And so I like that he added that unique and kind of creepy detail of the human hand appendage. That was just very creative. I also like the depiction of the angels. I didn't go much into this in the plot summary, but we see angels in two different scenes. We see them at the end at the Avignon Palace, but we also see an angel one other time before the ending during one of those anthology chapters. It occurs in a countryside field, and a really large gargantuan devil is slain by an angel. And the way the angel is described is it is an androgynous figure, a small figure, a being of pure light shaped in this humanoid fashion that accelerates from the sky with a blade. And the fight scene is a hopeful one because the presence of the holy or holy figures like angels is really in question for the majority of the book. We see terrible monsters and demons all over the place, but angels and the heavenly holy hosts are only ever seen twice in the book. So when they actually show up, it's a very cool scene, and it's always a breath of fresh air. I believe he did describe the Celestials as gender neutral, and the more classic image, they have this shining radiance, white armor or white garb. And so he doesn't do anything new with angel celestial lore, but I'm okay with that in this book. It seems appropriate. So I have several additional thoughts. I think that one of the most impressive achievements of this book is the way that Christopher incorporates history into the story in these very creative ways. There's a groundedness here that gives weight to a story that is incredibly entertaining, but also thoughtfully muses on one of the worst natural disasters in world history. Not only was the plague bad enough, not only were the symptoms themselves just terrible, but the economic fallout and the social fallout were also terrible. So the plague demonstrated without question that the apparent silence of God was and is a legitimate and valid question in light of something like the plague. And then my final thought, in case you're wondering about the title of the book, I believe that that there are two references there when the title of the book is Between Two Fires. The first is the fact, and this is true, that physicians recommended that Pope Clement VI sit between two blazing lamps in order to keep him safe from the plague at his palace in Avignon. They believed that sitting between the two fires would protect him, which again, kind of like putting the flowers up to your mouth to keep out the bad air. There's a grain of truth there that fire and heat has this cleansing effect on germs and that which is unclean. But obviously just sitting between two fires is not the way you want to combat a pandemic. But I also think that the title refers to the overall plot as well. Thomas and Delphine and Father Matthew and the people of France are caught between two spiritual fires, the fires of hell and the fires of heaven, as if the poor people of Europe are just these kind of casualties in this cosmic battle that rages around them. I'd be curious to check with Christopher that theory at some point, although I could definitely be reading way too much into it. So in conclusion, I highly recommend Between Two Fires. I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads because it was original, it was interesting. I never felt that the pace was dragging. I also recommend this as an October Halloween read, but I can also see it being a good read for any season in case you are too impatient to wait for next Halloween. So that's all for today, folks. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. Be good readers, and I will catch you in the next episode.